Good morning. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Happy Wellness Wednesday. I hope you are having a fabulous morning already. Looks to be a beautiful day. Little chilly down here, but not as much as we thought it was going to be this week. So if you're just stumbling on my page, my name is Donna. I'm a mom, a nana, a significant other. I am a runner, a jazzerciser, an activewear fanatic with an online boutique, and I am also a grad student seeking my Master of Science in clinical mental health counseling. Good morning, Miss Carla. So if you're here, let me know you're here. And if you don't see this until afterwards, please hit hashtag replay in the comments or drop a comment or ask a question and let me know you saw this. Good morning, Stacy. So when I started Wellness Wednesday 68 episodes ago, I get excited every single week. When I started Wellness Wednesday, it was because I have been on a lifelong battle with depression and anxiety, something I believe that you are never totally recovered from, but you are in recovery. I find that hearing others share their information and sharing mine helps me and sometimes others, right? So that was why I started Wellness Wednesday, so that I could share things that I learned. I love to learn, so if I don't know something, I try to look it up. I try to learn more about it. I also have an itchy nose this morning. Sorry. So I love to learn about stuff. So if I don't know about something, I research it, and those are some of the things that I share here if I have a random thought or somebody asks me a question. So if you ever have a topic you'd like to see me cover, as long as it's not politics or negativity, you can feel free, good morning, Miss Kayla, to message me or drop a comment or whatever, and I'll see if I can work it in. So today, we often on Wellness Wednesday, good morning, Miss Dawn, we often end up talking about mindset. There's lots of components to wellness, and some of those are food and exercise. However, there's a lot of wellness that has to do with how we think and how we look at things, right? So we usually end up digging into mindset. Last week, we talked about reverse brainstorming, which can change how we view things and make us think outside of the box a little bit. And if you enjoyed that, I hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't get a chance to see it, let me know, and I'll be happy to tag you in that video so that you can check it out. But you can always check out the videos by going to the videos tab on my page or by scrolling down as well, because they stay there. Facebook leaves them forever if you ask them to. So I hope if you did watch it, I hope you enjoyed it. Today we're going to talk about boundaries. And the reason we're going to talk about boundaries is because in a lot of these Wellness Wednesday videos, I mention boundaries in some form or fashion, but we've never really actually fleshed out boundaries themselves. So it seemed like a good topic today. All right, so what are boundaries and why do we need them? Well, setting a boundary indicates that this is what I'm okay with, or in your case, what you're okay with and not okay with. Boundaries can protect personal space, they can protect physical and mental health, and they can also protect our safety and security. Another term often used here in the physical sense is personal space bubble regarding physical boundaries, and they create a clear line of how we would like to be treated no matter what we call it. So when our boundaries are crossed or violated, and it is basically an invisible line, this is kind of like a set of standards that you have that is how you expect to be treated and hopefully how you treat others as well. But when they're crossed or violated, even by ourselves, yes, I said that, and we're going to talk about more about that in a minute. Even when they're crossed by ourselves, it often results in anger, resentment, and anxiety, and sometimes depression. And I find that the depression comes more when we allow others to cross our boundaries and don't do anything about it. So that makes it kind of a hazy boundary, right? And so then we start getting on ourselves, and that's sometimes where depression can stem from this as well. So it makes boundaries incredibly important in all of our relationships. And having boundaries helps to promote autonomy. It improves relationships and mental health. It decreases stress and can ward off burnout and promotes respect from others and from ourselves. And it also opens the window to self-care. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a definition of what I mean when I'm talking about boundaries today. So how do we set those? Well, when we're setting them with others and with ourselves, it's important that we recognize our worth and how we deserve to be treated. And we also need to recognize when our tolerances and triggers are, or what they are, where they are, what they are, and the motivation behind them. So this means often a little bit of personal work, because what happens is you have to communicate your boundaries, because if you don't communicate them, and that can be a big problem for a lot of us, then nobody knows what they are. And especially if we don't enforce them, then they're not really a boundary, are they? They're more like, on the playground, you draw a line in the sand and the other mean little kid kicks it out, you know what I mean? And covers it up with their foot. So, and it's important here when you're doing that personal work to determine what your tolerance levels are and what your triggers are. And I use the word trigger loosely because it is a thing. Unfortunately, as I've mentioned before, it gets kind of overhyped. The word trigger gets overhyped and overused in today's society. But there are things that are triggers, and it's important for us to recognize those in ourselves, and understand the motivation behind them, and whether there's something that needs to be paid attention to and asked for as a boundary, if you will, or stated as a boundary. Asked is not a good word. Or if it's something that we need to work on because maybe certain things make us overreact a little bit. So you also need to pay attention to your body reactions, because some things that bother you, you may not realize bother you until you find yourself, you've read a text or you've had somebody cross a boundary, and all of a sudden your heart rate's up and your stomach feels sick and you're having a physical, visceral response, and you don't know what to do about it, and you don't understand why. And that means more than likely that you had a mental boundary there that somebody has crossed, or something has upset you, and you need to figure out why and figure out if this is something that you need to set as a boundary, if that makes sense. So an example I have of where I had a boundary that I didn't necessarily recognize that I had was when a family member was coming to visit, and they had a teenager who was a little bit older than my daughter at the time. And these kids were all in the range of 17 to 19 years old. And this particular person, this particular mother had already been allowing her child to have a beer or two once in a while when they were, as long as they were home and safe. And that was okay. That was okay for them. A lot of people do it. A lot of people have the approach that if they're doing it in front of me, I would rather they do it in front of me than do it behind my back. This way I know they're safe. And I can understand and identify with that concept. However, it didn't work for me, and I didn't allow it for my daughter. So when this person wanted to come visit and asked if it was okay to bring beer for their child, I had a visceral response. I had a physical reaction, like, what am I going to do? I don't know how to handle this. This is not okay with me. I don't allow my daughter to do it. So what do I do? And it was a very physical, and this was at a time when I was pretty high anxiety and not very good at standing up for myself or drawing lines in the sand. And after a couple of days of thought, I finally had to call that person and say, listen, I understand this is what you do and that works for you, but in my house, I don't condone that with my daughter. And so I can't in good conscience allow it to happen with somebody else, because I can't justify that with her. And they understood, and they were good about it. I was calm when I said it. And I made the statement. But again, if you don't even know what makes you react, you can't convey that to others in a normal tone that asks for understanding and states what you're willing to accept. They were perfectly understanding. Everything was fine. And I didn't really have to worry so much about that again. But I then knew that was a line that I was not going to cross as a parent. And that didn't make the other person wrong. It didn't make me right or wrong. It didn't make them right or wrong. It was my boundary versus theirs. And they understood. So when it was in my house, it just wasn't allowed at that time. So the important thing here, like I said, is to recognize where our tolerances and triggers are and the motivation that's behind them. The motivation for me at the time was to adhere to what I had set as a boundary for my daughter. It wasn't so much about a boundary for myself, but to adhere to a boundary I had set for my daughter, and knowing as a parent that if I caved on that, then it was going to result in pushing, in her pushing maybe a little bit further, or others pushing a little bit further with her or on her behalf. So that's one of the reasons why they're very, very important. And you got to start small. You got to focus on one thing at a time sometimes, especially if you're not one that's known for setting boundaries, or it feels like confrontation to you when you actually do speak your feelings or speak your emotions. If it feels like confrontation, then you definitely need to start small and with one thing at a time. And again, if it feels like confrontation, which it often can be, sometimes, especially depending on our background and our upbringing and our way of thinking, setting a boundary kindly and respectfully can feel like confrontation, because we so seldom stand up for ourselves that it often becomes a gigantic explosion when we finally have had enough and we do it, right? So if we can recognize those things ahead of time and focus on one thing and be able to practice it, maybe even practice it in the mirror. For example, if you have somebody that's been continually, let's say, verbally abusing you, somebody maybe that's not your significant other, but somebody in the workplace, somebody that's a friend, but you find, I had a friend once, who was constantly in front of other people making joking remarks that were very negative about me. And I really, really struggled with it. And I really struggled to know how to stand up for myself and say something about it, because my self-esteem was about this big. And this was a friend, but she routinely made me the scapegoat, the butt of a joke, the scapegoat for whatever. And over time, it became apparent that some of it was coming from a fairly hostile place. And I never could figure it out. But finally, I had to do a little personal work, and I had to say, I had to reflect back over what had happened. I had to do something, because I couldn't spend time with that person anymore. And so finally I practiced in the mirror, and it felt like a confrontation. I wasn't looking for an argument. I wasn't looking to yell. I was simply looking to state, this is not okay with me. This has been going on for a while, and I've never really said anything, and this is not okay with me. So I had to practice in the mirror. I had to kind of rehearse it with myself. We've talked about rehearsal a little bit before. Sometimes if we're high on anxiety, rehearsal can actually amp us up even more and get us even more worked up about it. But sometimes rehearsal is productive, where we can kind of look at it and be like, okay, this is what I need to say. Let's practice it. Let's, change how it sounds and play with it a little bit. Because I never ever want to make anybody feel in any kind of way that I felt if I felt badly at some point in time. Does that make sense? So I practiced in the mirror, and I finally said to her, this is not working for me. You seem to find a lot of negative things to say, especially in front of other people, and you make it sound like a joke, but it feels more like it's real. And it's making me very uncomfortable. And she continued to do it, so I stopped spending time with her. I just started coming up with excuses why I couldn't go when I was invited, and I had to put an end to that because I had recognized that this was a boundary for me and that I needed to stick to it. So rehearsal can help, especially when we often feel like anytime we stand up for ourselves or the way we feel like it's going to be a confrontation, and it doesn't have to be. And if we don't like confrontation, then that's a very amplified fight or flight response sometimes. I can remember getting ready to break up with a boyfriend, and it was well overdue, but I had myself so worked up before I got the chance to talk to him that I was having a panic attack at home. So like I said, even just stating your feelings when you're not looking for any kind of an argument, when you're going out of your way to avoid one, can feel like confrontation, depending on how we talk and how we approach it. So how do we do this? Well, like I said, we start small and we focus on one thing at a time. Practice it in the mirror, write it down. Deal with the fear of confrontation. Thank you, Miss Carla. It is a very good approach with a lot of things, not just boundary setting. Number 2, be calm, clear, and firm, and address it when it's appropriate. If you're having a conversation about the great coffee that's in your cup, and all of a sudden out of the blue mid-sentence, you're like, by the way, I don't like it when you do this, that's not really always the appropriate time. Usually the appropriate time is when something has come up that's bothering you and you haven't really spoken to that person since it started. Then you can approach it with, listen, I need to talk to you about something that's really been bothering me. I actually just had to do that recently with a friend of mine. And I just want to explain why it bothers me and ask a couple questions so that I can put it in its proper place. So that, and the bottom line here is so that if it happens again, you're not flipping your lid because you've not dealt with this and you've been stuffing and stuffing and stuffing and just allowing it to happen because nobody knew. And all of a sudden you've reached your limit and you're like, nah. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So be calm, be clear and firm, and address it when it's appropriate before, if possible, it becomes a huge problem. If somebody's done something once or twice, like this friend I talked about that was kind of a bully, but more just she thought she was being funny. And she didn't understand how that, I guess that was her love language, for lack of a better way to put it, because she hadn't learned another one. So it's important to address these things before they come to a head whenever possible, because a lot of times it can avoid that confrontation that we fear that keeps us from speaking up to begin with, if that makes sense. So again, be calm, clear, firm, address it when it's appropriate, whenever possible. Use I statements. I talked about those in another Wellness Wednesday recently too. Use I statements and focus on your needs while being respectful. So this should not look like, I wish you would quit doing that. And I probably didn't maybe handle it the right way. Yes. And humor as a love language can be okay, but when it's self-deprecating, or when it becomes, what's the word I'm looking for? When it becomes negative towards the other person, even if you think it's funny, sometimes it can be really hurtful, and sometimes they just won't say anything. Because let's face it, most people are not good at drawing boundaries or speaking up for themselves. That's why we're here. So that's a great point, Stacy, and I'm glad that you can own that. I have also been guilty of it myself. I have been guilty of violating physical boundaries, because for a while, my love language with my best friend in school was to punch her in the shoulder till she punched me back one day. Just saying. So, if I made a joke and I thought something was funny, pulling the puppy's tail. That's a very, very interesting way of looking at it, Carla. And I'm going to have to chew on that one for a while, but I get where you're going with that. But yes, I had a best friend in school. She was my best friend in the whole world. She was my bosom buddy, whatever we called it back then. But every time I would make a joke or I would laugh at one of her jokes, I would punch her in the shoulder. Not sure where I got that from. Not sure why I was doing it, but I would punch her in the shoulder. And she warned me a couple of times, and I tried really hard not to do it. And then inevitably, at some point, I would forget myself and I'd punch her in the shoulder again. Finally, she whaled me one good in the shoulder. And that was her way of telling me, I'm done with this. She had tried to warn me in her defense. And guess what? I never punched her in the shoulder again. So I learned my lesson, but in that case, I was the aggressor, and it had to come to a head at some point for me to get the message, because she set her boundary and I wasn't listening. I wasn't listening. Even though on my part, I was trying and it was kind of subconscious, I wasn't listening. So use I statements, focus on your needs while being respectful. So, if I had gone to this woman, and I'm known to wait many days, sometimes even weeks before I speak up about something and stew on it to make sure I understand why I'm upset about it. And whether or not I actually think they intend anything about it, and to figure out the best way to approach it, because I don't want to start an argument or be confrontational or make them feel bad like I've been feeling, right? So, I've been known to wait a while, but if it had looked something like, you are so mean to me, why do you do this all the time? It really makes me mad when you do this. You hear all the yous? The conversation Well, with this particular individual, I can't guarantee the conversation would have gone any differently. She may have still acknowledged it and then still continued to do it, kind of like I did with my friend from school, right? But I statements are definitely much better and usually a lot less confrontational, such as, I feel uncomfortable when you do this. It's okay sometimes to ask why they do it, but sometimes that can go a place that it doesn't need to go. And when you're drawing boundaries, explanations are not necessary all the time. Sometimes you just need to be like, I'm not okay with being spoken to like this. And if you do it again, I am going to stop responding to you. Whatever that case may be. I'm going to stop answering your phone calls. I'm going to stop responding to your messages. Anything like that. So again, use I statements, focus on your needs and why you're setting that boundary, but also be respectful of them and their feelings. And sometimes that's why questions are helpful, because it can help you, if you're in the state of mind to hear it, understand why they're doing what they're doing or why they've crossed the boundary. So sometimes it can be productive, but it's important to be calm and have it as a conversation, not as an attack or anything like that. And make sure it's a statement, not a question. Like I said, it's appropriate in some cases to ask a question to try to understand their side, but it's not, the best approach is not, why do you treat me like this? I need you to stop. Because again, there's that you statement. Or can you please stop treating me like this? It's a question. It's not a statement. You can hear the difference. It's not very firm, right? It sounds more like it's a passive aggressive, why are you doing this to me? Victim type stance, and that's not the approach you want to take. You can be assertive without being confrontational. And that took me a very long time to learn, and it's something I still struggle with a little bit, which is why it takes me so long to speak up if I'm having an issue. So again, start small, be calm, clear, and firm, and address it when it's appropriate, whenever possible. Use I statements and focus on your needs while being respectful to them, and make it a statement, not a question. I'm not comfortable versus why do you? And again, that circles right back around to that I statement or question. All right. So unfortunately, we also often need to set boundaries for ourselves, from ourselves. Before I get into that, No, we'll just go. I had a little note here about a story, but I'm not sure this is the right place. So with ourselves, we have to sometimes set boundaries. And I mentioned that briefly a few minutes ago. And where is that most common? Well, with our self-talk. I've mentioned self-talk a lot of times before. My opinion, and something I still have to fight with myself on, just to be clear. These things I talk about are things I still struggle with, sometimes on a daily basis. Talking about them helps to remind me of where I need to be. And that's part of the reason we do the Wellness Wednesday. So self-talk. I'm a firm believer that you should not say anything to yourself in the mirror that you wouldn't say to the person you love the most. But I have been guilty of and have seen, as I've exampled before, many situations where I or someone else, or I've witnessed someone else literally tear themselves down in the mirror. Or general comments, why are you so stupid? And even if you're joking, because sometimes we can make ourselves the butt of our own jokes, right? Self-deprecating humor. Like Stacy just mentioned, sometimes that's our love language with ourselves too. Oh, you moron, how could you do that? You're so dumb. Over time, that doesn't sound so funny anymore. And what we say, to ourselves is what becomes our inner monologue, right? So sometimes we have to set those boundaries. I have to set boundaries with myself, especially right now since I'm carrying a little bit of extra weight that I don't particularly care for. I will start picking myself apart. I will start picking myself apart in front of the mirror, and I have to stop myself. And now it gets to one thing, and I'm like, Donna, stop it. You look great. You look wonderful. Your eyes are beautiful. You've got a great smile. Just go. And I don't linger in front of the mirror picking it apart. So I am much better than I used to be, but I do still struggle because it is a process. It's a journey. It's not a destination. So negative self-talk is sometimes where we have to set those boundaries for ourselves. And we have to say, sometimes we got to write it down. Sometimes we got to put an affirmation on the mirror in dry erase marker or post-it note and say, when you start thinking ugly, think this word instead, or you are beautiful, or whatever's working for you to help derail that negative self-talk. Sometimes we have to set that boundary and say, I'm not going to do this anymore. And make a plan. So when I start thinking about this, I'm going to think about this. When I start thinking that I look horrible and ugly, I'm going to think about this picture of me when I was the most beautiful I've ever seen myself. And I was so surprised when I saw the picture that I just had to have it because I couldn't believe how good I looked. You see the difference? So sometimes we have to set that boundary even with ourselves and make a plan. We also need to know when to quit. And I'm going to talk that now is the time for my story. Okay, one more minute. We need to make sure that we're not responding to things outside of appropriate times. A lot of times this can come into play with work because boundaries are appropriate at work as well, right? So if we don't understand why people are constantly poking us at 8 o'clock at night, then maybe we need to stop responding to them when they do. Maybe we need to say, hey, listen, I get done working at 5 or 6. I start work at 7 or 8. It's a long day. Once I'm home, I am not responding to you unless you are literally on fire. And sometimes I do that in a joking fashion, which I don't really have to so much anymore. But sometimes I used to do that in a joking fashion to make it clear that I was, I needed this boundary. If it's 8 o'clock at night, I don't want to hear from you unless you are legit on fire. And then if I can't, you should call 911 first because there's not much I can do for you at that point, right? So not responding to things outside of the appropriate times. And then I have often imposed a 4-hour minimum wait rule on myself. This is boundary setting because I know that sometimes I could have strong reactions. So if I got an email that I didn't care for or a message that really wound me up, I would force myself to go back and reread it again in 4 hours before I responded to make sure that I was responding out of genuine understanding and not out of just a reaction, because sometimes that can make it. So those are examples of boundaries we can set for ourselves, especially because sometimes we just need to. And there's a lot of other examples, but these are the best. So now there are also times where we need to know when to quit, right? And I got in an argument with somebody that had formerly, yes, waited out, Carla. That's exactly right. I love your one-liners today. You're pulling the puppy's tail and waited out. So there was a person that, was sort of my boss, but sort of not. It's kind of hard to explain the relationship. It was supposed to be a colleague type situation, but sometimes they got pretty bossy, for lack of a better way to put it. Now I've had a handful of adult bullies in my life. And I firmly believe that God kept putting me back in that situation until I finally learned to stand up for myself. Well, once this person was no longer kind of my boss, they were also still a colleague in another situation. And apparently they didn't realize that they were just a colleague at that point. And it really wouldn't matter anyway, because even as a boss, they really weren't handling the situation right. But I made a mistake. And when I was asked about it, I owned it. And I worked as quickly as I could to fix it. And this individual called me on the phone and started screaming at me, to basically telling me how inept I was and not understanding why I didn't get this done. And it was really a very small issue. It really was a very small issue that was easily remedied, just a little bit late. Nobody's life depended on it. Nobody was on fire. Nobody's bones were broken. It really was a fairly minor issue. But this person literally lost their noodle on me on the phone. And I was extremely upset. So much so that I said, when you can speak to me, because I used to always have a tendency to kind of sacrifice myself in the name of being professional. So much so that I finally said, when you are able to talk to me like a human being, I will talk to you. Right now, I got to go. because I was about to lose my noodle. And as we know, that's really not productive when somebody's screaming at us to just start screaming back, right? So I waited a few minutes and I was upset. And I kind of talked it out with the person that was in my office with me. And finally, I typed an email with that person there, the other person, so that I could get a second set of eyeballs. I did not impose the minimum weight rule. I will be honest with you. This was not one of those situations where I imposed the minimum weight rule. I typed out an email and I was furiously typing like think Bruce Almighty. When he's trying to answer all those prayers, my fingers were just flying. And I said, per our conversation on the phone. And you know, anytime it starts out with per our conversation, somebody's in trouble, right? So per our conversation on the phone, I do not deserve to be spoken to the way you spoke to me. I need you to understand that this is not I am not your errant child. I am not your employee. I am your equal. We are both volunteers. And if I am spoken to like that again, I will resign. It was a board type situation. I will resign from this board and eliminate this issue for everybody. So that is an example of how I finally started to stand up for myself, but it took me years to do it, especially in a professional setting. And even though I was at my office when this went down, the board in question didn't have anything to do with my job for the most part. But it was just a bad situation. I did not impose the minimum 4-hour weight rule. I did email back instead of calling back because I knew I wouldn't be able to keep my cool on the phone. I knew that I could keep my cool in an email and look at the verbiage and reword it so that it sounded professional but firm, and I could have a little more control there over myself. Not over anybody else, just over myself. And that person did end up calling me back and apologizing. But sometimes you got to know when to quit. And it wasn't a threat. It wasn't a threat that I made. I was going to resign from that board if I was ever spoken to by that person like that again. So it wasn't a threat. It wasn't an ultimatum. Sometimes we can look at things like this, like ultimatums, and everybody automatically kind of gets a little defensive, when they hear the word, are you giving me an ultimatum? Well, no, when you're asking for boundaries or when you're stating that you need this boundary, it's not an ultimatum. It's this is how I feel. And if you can't respect that, then our relationship or the dynamics are going to change. It's that simple. And I know it sounds simple. It's really not that simple. It's really very hard to get to that point. And I totally get it. So where can this become a problem? Where can setting boundaries become a problem or fail? Communication. I kind of touched on that already. Part of the problem with boundaries is even if we have them, we aren't always great at communicating them. So if they're just up here, people don't know that they exist, right? Just like this woman that kept using me as the butt of her mean jokes didn't know that she was violating a boundary because I hadn't said anything to her. It never occurred to me that I was violating my friend's boundary by continuing to punch her in the shoulder until she said something. So we have to communicate our boundaries, but the more clearly and calmly we can communicate them, the better off we are. Or they do turn into, like I said, turn into those confrontations that we're trying really hard to avoid. We need to do unto others. When we communicate a boundary such as don't call me after 8, I'm not going to answer the phone, and then we turn around and do it to them, that's not really conducive to showing and asking for respect. The note that I have here is don't say no and tell yourself that it's okay to say no and then get upset when others say no to you. So it's not just a verbal thing. It's not just a physical thing. It's a mental thing too. If we set a boundary for ourselves and then that we're going to start saying no more often and that we're going to be okay with it and we're not going to feel the need to over-explain it, then we can't get upset when somebody does the same thing to us, when somebody says no to us, because they're just asserting their boundaries too, right? So if we set a boundary, we can't get upset with somebody else when we violate theirs. So it's kind of a do unto others rule. If you want people to respect your boundaries, it's important that you also respect theirs. No consequences. This is often a problem. How do I define a consequence? I had a friend who, when she first started working out, she discovered long before I did, and she kind of, I think, tried to explain it to me, but I had to get it on my own. She discovered that working out changed her attitude. It made her more productive for the day. It made her brain rattle less. And I really literally, I had this note here, but I just realized that she tried to tell me probably years before I stumbled on it that exercise could make a huge difference in my anxiety by using herself as an example, and I didn't pick up on it. So it's important that we listen. In any case, she started working out. She had some friends that were really upset with her because she was no longer as available. She was no longer available early in the mornings. And sometimes she would pass on going out for drinks because she needed to be in bed by 8 or 9 o'clock so she could get up in the morning to work out. And she finally said, listen, guys, if I don't do this, then I'm going to be a butthole when I am spending time with you. I'm not going to be nice. I'm going to be rushed, and I may even have to cancel on you because I'm not going to have other things done that I need to have done. So she defined a consequence. And it was not an ultimatum. It was very simply, if I don't do this, I can't be present for and make time for you. So I need you to respect that this is my boundary and not be upset with me because I'm not available during these times, because it means that I can be more available for you when you do need me. And that made perfect sense to me. So that's an example of defining a consequence. If you continue to call me at 8 o'clock at night, I am not going to respond. That's just the one I keep going back to because it's the simplest example. For those of you that do message me or whatever after 8, it's fine. You know who you are, and it's fine. If I can't answer or don't want to answer, I just won't. But things like that, that's an example. So there is a consequence. For example, in the situation I spoke of, once I finally drew my line in the sand, and that wasn't the first time I'd been spoken to like that, but that was by far the worst. And since I didn't feel like it was a power dynamic anymore, I felt like in that particular situation and the subject we were speaking about was we were equals, it made it easier for me to stand up for myself. Even though I still kind of felt like the power dynamic was there because of who the person was. So there needs to be a consequence. If you ever speak to me like that again, I'm out. Whatever that case may be. You know what I mean? If it's absolutely something that you will not tolerate. For example, family members again. I witnessed a family member being treated very badly in front of me. And due to the situation, I bit my tongue and didn't say anything at the time. But when the subject came up of those particular people possibly coming for Thanksgiving, I made the statement that I had kept my mouth shut about it once, and that they were welcome to come. But if I witnessed anyone being treated like that in front of me again, I was not, especially in my own house, I was not going to be quiet about it. And that particular part of the family didn't end up coming for Thanksgiving, which was fine. So apparently they didn't like my boundary and they went out of their way to avoid it. And that's okay too. That's totally okay too. Sometimes people are not going to respond well to you setting your boundaries, and they're going to try to push, or they're just going to kind of disappear. And that probably means they're not your people and that they weren't very respectful of you to begin with. I know that's hard to hear, especially when you're talking about family or close, longtime friends. But that's just facts. So you got to set a consequence. You have to define a consequence. Otherwise, the boundaries don't work. I know it's very sad, Carla. And it can often be construed as an ultimatum, as we discussed. But usually the people that look at it as an ultimatum are already on the defensive, right? Or if somebody's like, oh, they're going to think I'm giving them an ultimatum, that means you're already timid and you need to be setting these boundaries anyway, right? So that's generally when people look at something as an ultimatum, is when they're on the defense or when they're scared of asserting themselves. All right, so being too nice. That's another problem that can come along with setting boundaries. Being too nice. Well, here's my boundary. Oh, you crossed it. Oh, you crossed it again. No, you crossed it again, and I'm still not saying anything. That's being too nice. That's not enforcing your boundary. We truly do teach people how to treat us, and that is how, when we say we're not okay with this, and then we continue to be okay with it. And And it's important. You don't have to over explain your boundaries. Sometimes that comes across almost as apologizing. You don't have to say, listen, I'm really sorry, but it's just not okay when you talk to me like that because of this and because of that. And well, do you understand how I feel? And why would you continue to do that? And it makes me feel this way. And then, and then there's this. This is another reason why I need you. Now, I need you to stop speaking to me this way. I need you to stop calling me after 8 o'clock at night. Or outside of work hours or whatever. You don't need to over-explain it because that tends to come across more as apologizing and you're already eroding at your own boundaries. And then what if it doesn't work? Well, then sometimes you possibly need to remove yourself from the situation or remove them from the situation, which is sometimes your life. Unfortunately, that has happened. But most often you just need to remove yourself from the situation. Example, the family members I spoke of. They didn't like my boundary for Thanksgiving. So they didn't come. And that was okay. They didn't like it, so they removed themselves. But I set my boundary and I stuck to it. And then I didn't have to worry about enforcing it, right? So if it doesn't work, sometimes you have to remove yourself from the situation. I had another bully that actually was the reason, I won't say caused, because that's not the truth, was the reason I removed myself from a job for 6 months. I left for 6 months. I did end up going back to that job once that person was gone. But again, we talked about visceral physical reactions. This person was violating my boundaries to the point where I was actually considering physical violence. And I have never, ever, 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 did I say ever? Been a physical person. So when I was actually contemplating physical violence with this person, I knew I had to get out. So we have to recognize, like I said, our own tolerances and our own limitations and know that if setting a boundary doesn't work and that person continues to cross it, then it is time to leave. And that's that know when to quit situation. So those are some of the problems that can come along with setting boundaries. They can be overcome if you have a plan for dealing with them. Like I said, knowing when to quit, knowing when to just remove yourself from the situation, 4-hour minimum wait rules, right? Not responding. If you've said, don't contact me outside of work hours, then not responding. Thank you, Carla. I firmly believe we can learn as much about what not to do as we can from people as we can about what to do. So remember these final things. I'm running a little over today, but it was a great topic and I love the input you have given me. Remember these final things. The first step to setting boundaries is always to recognize and believe in your worth, that you are worth whatever that boundary is. You are worth being spoken to kindly, that you can say, listen, you're really upset right now. When you can talk to me like a human being, give me a call because I can't right now. It's okay to say those things and you don't have to yell it. You can just be like, all right, this is where I'm at. In fact, I have found that I accomplish a lot more, up to and including as a parent, with a firm tone than I ever did by screaming. Just for the record, that seems to work all the way across the board. So the first step is to recognize and believe in your worth. Believe that you are worth the boundary you're setting. Be respectful and calm in your communication and set those boundaries before it becomes reactive instead of proactive. Before you lose your noodle because you've just put up with it for way too long and never said anything. Good morning, Victoria. I'm almost done. So when you get a chance, come back and watch. Follow through. Enforce your boundaries. Y'all, this is just like parenting. Our parents always told us, or our mentors or whatever, that if you tell a child no and then you turn around and tell them yes, the next time you're going to have to tell them no twice. The time after that, you're going to have to tell them no 3 times. If you cave. My daughter really didn't get in trouble a whole lot till she hit high school, and that's typical. But she knew if I said, you're grounded, that was it. If I said, you're grounded for 3 days, it was 3 days. It was 3 solid days. It wasn't 2 days. It wasn't 1 day. It wasn't 2 days and 59 minutes. It was 3 stinking days. Because once I did set the boundary or the punishment or whatever, I didn't cave because I had seen what kind of attitude that could produce in other parents with their children, and I wasn't doing it. I knew what kind of, I had examples of that when I was growing up. And as an adult of what happens when you don't enforce rules, when you don't enforce boundaries. Boundaries are rules. It's just a different name. It's semantics. Boundaries are rules. So yes. So when you set them, enforce them, because when you don't enforce them, it allows people to violate them continually. They're like, oh, well, she said this, but I'm doing it anyway. And sometimes it's not even a conscious thing, but that can lead to a lot of negative self-talk and beating up of ourselves, because now not only are they violating our boundaries, but we know it's our fault. We know it's because we let them do it and we don't know how to stop. So follow through. Like I said, this is just like parenting. Every inch becomes a mile. You give them an inch, they're going to try to take a mile. And it's up to you to enforce your boundaries, not anybody else. And then again, finally, sometimes you got to know when to quit in extreme cases of physical violence, like I just gave you an example of, where I was contemplating physical violence, where you don't think you can keep yourself under control anymore. Or the situation is becoming dangerous. If your bully becomes a physical aggressor, whatever, sometimes you just got to know when to quit. Or in the case of my friend that used humor and used me as the butt of her jokes, you just stop spending time with those people that can't respect your boundaries. So that is it. I'm going to let you go. This one ran a little long, but I hope you got something out of it. Lots of information in here. If you loved it, share it. If you think it can help somebody else, share it. You can also share it to their messenger so that nobody else sees you shared it to them. If you don't want to single anybody out. Again, as always, if you have a topic you'd like to see me cover, send me a message. If you want to see the links I worked from today, send me a message. And above all, I hope that you all have a fabulous Wednesday. I'm not sure yet what we're talking about next week. Sometimes they come to me kind of out of the blue and I'm like, oh, that's a perfect topic. So we'll see, but I will see you next Wednesday. And in the meantime, be well. Thank you.